Alright, hello everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Naven Reacts, where today I'm going to be reacting to obscure marine chapters, Someone's Gotta Be the Sea Listers, by Pancreas No Work. Ay, ay, a couple of things before we get into it. So, I think I figured out what happened with the Shoe on Head video, right? I basically, I think what happened was that because I paused during the recording, directly during the recording of that video a couple of times. What ended up happening, right, was that I I essentially desynced the audio because by pausing the video, I think what happened is that because of the interruptions that caused during the recording process, it ended up desyncing the visuals and the audio in such a way to where like everything was just off kilter. And so to resolve this issue, and that's just me spitballing, right? That's the only thing I did differently outside of, how I usually record my content. But yeah. So in order to fix that, I went into Clipchamp, right? And I basically what I did is that I detached the audio and then I resynced the audio by by checking the dialogue versus the lip sync, and I tried to lip sync it as close as humanly possible. And yeah, I'm not sure, like while I got the shoe on head video to be synced properly, the me specifically, I'm not too sure if that's lined up properly because it didn't seem like it, but that's neither here nor there. It could just be that the model is a little slow. I have no idea. But otherwise, at least it seemed like the shoe on head video was consistent all the way through. Um, but yeah, that's basically how I did it. I basically had to adjust the audio and the visuals essentially to line the video back up proper. But yeah, outside of that, so the other news that have that I've gotten was that I came into work today, right? And essentially one of my bosses asked me if I could work these next few days to essentially cover for coverage, right? Because this is technically supposed to be my Friday, and I'm supposed to go on to my weekend. It's not the case. So what ended up happening is that they asked me if I could cover it, and I, because it was somebody else asking through the boss to do it, I was like, fine, sure, why not? So now I'm essentially working, after this, so I'm basically working like 7 to 8 days of essentially, of just in a row of just working, which is great. All right, but yeah, other than that, right? Because like this job isn't exactly like a full-time thing. It's kind of like a part-time thing, but they've been messing with my schedule in such a way to where it's just like I'm kind of perturbed by the inconsistency of it. And with this new addition of me working tomorrow, the next day, and so on, it's it's I'm not sure when I'm gonna have time to really look into the whole, like, not just the recording videos for reactions and among other things, but also just a stream and also look into the whole kick streaming thing. And so I'm basically kind of like I'm gonna have to put a few of these things on hold until I could get that sorted. But if nothing else, I'm going as soon as I get the free time I'm gonna start streaming on YouTube again. That way that way I can go back to streaming in some fashion and not just doing reactions. But yeah, once that's done and once I get the free time to do that, I'm gonna basically be able to do that. Other news though, you know, outside of that, I'm kind of just like I'm a bit tired because I did spend the whole night essentially trying to edit that fucking shoe on Ed video right now. But other than that, to me being perturbed by my inconsistent scheduling, among other things, uh, yeah, that's all I had to announce. So, yeah, without further ado, I guess we'll just go ahead and leave it at that and just get right into it, shall we? Obscure Marine chapters, someone's gotta be the Sea Listers. By Pancreas No Work. Please leave a like, subscribe if you haven't, and leave a comment down below if you could. Literally anything to support the original creator. I'm a little nerfed right now because, again, I am fucking tired. But yeah, I'll try my best to basically give as much input and to kind of contribute to the conversation as much as humanly possible, because I do like Warhammer. I like the conversations around Warhammer. I'm also kind of curious to see what kind of chapters he ends up covering, because, you know, it looks like he shows the Death Watch for maybe some Templars, at least from the cover of this. So I'm not too sure or familiar about those two particular factions, so, you know, kind of interested to see what he has to say about them. But otherwise, yeah, let's just go ahead and get right into it. Enough lollygagging.
Covering Warhammer can very quickly lead one into a bit of a conundrum. On the one hand, variety is the spice of life, and it's always enjoyable to branch out a bit. Keeps things fresh for the viewer and interesting for me. On the other hand, I enjoy making more than $0 a month, and so must eventually bend the knee to Lord James and his workshop and talk about Space Marines. There's just no escaping it. So today I will do my part and do just that, because in the grim darkness of the far future, there's a lot of Space Marines out there. Officially, there's 1,000 chapters more or less, which means at minimum we got 1,000,000 Marines out there.
Oh my god, there's so many chapters, and even just not even talking about the mainline successor chapters, like, excuse me, there's like so many other chapters that bridged off from that, just either half mentioned, somewhat subtly mentioned, or even whatever the hell, right? Like, there's just so many. Like, I saw a whole list of successor chapters and second foundings, third foundings, all that good stuff. And it's crazy just how many chapters of Space Marines there actually is that just are just out there in the galaxy. It's crazy. It's really insane. I mean, it makes for a lot of interesting sort of like lore delving, but oh my god, there's so many. But it definitely lends itself to really being welcoming for if you want to build your own homebrew or whatever the hell. You're in good company. But yeah, there's just a lot. It's crazy. He's not kidding. There's like millions of them.
That's not a lot galactically speaking, but it's still a lot of groups of goobers, and today we're going to talk about some of the less prominent ones. Not necessarily lesser known, but the ones that are off to the sidelines more often than not. No talk of Ultramarines and Blood Angels here, we're off to the fringes today. After all, while the narrative importance of the major legions and some successor chapters means they get most of the attention and best narratives, the ones to the sideline make the setting feel full. In a universe this big, we need people that are just around in the sidelines, and the Space Marines we'll talk about today are just that. Maybe they're fairly active and still occasionally show up in modern day lore. Maybe they don't really do too much, but they still pop up once in a blue moon to say hello. And maybe, just maybe, they're from a single White Dwarf article and have never reappeared since. All and more are welcome, so sit down and get ready for yet another dose of Space Marine slop. But before I start yammering on, I'm gonna make an assumption about you. You eat food. And because you eat food, I've got just the thing for you. Factor, the sponsor of this video. Factor is a meal delivery service that sends chef-crafted, dietitian-approved, and most importantly, delicious meals straight to your front door. I do not like leaving my house for shopping. I know I have to sometimes, I know it just has to happen, but I and probably most of you don't like going shopping for food and whatnot. Well, with Factor, that's a thing of the past. No more shopping trips, no cook prep, no cleanup beyond throwing the tray in the garbage. Just 2 minutes in the microwave, and you're good to go. And it's got plenty of other meal options for you to choose from as well. Breakfast, smoothies, and some juices I can personally vouch for are all some of the options for you to enjoy. Since a proper sleeping schedule is well beyond me at this point, I like to have some Factor at night. When dinner time for me is most people's time to wake up, it's nice to know that Factor is my back when it's time to chow down. And if you too would like a nice Factor meal, I've got just the thing for you. Head to Factor75.com or click the link below and use code 50Pancreas to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first Factor box. That's code 50Pancreas at Factor75.com Code45.com to get 50% off plus free shipping on your first box. If you want to get some good grub or just want something quick to chow down on, you can do no better than Factor, so use my link so you can get yourself some of the finest food out there. Now then, let's see what the B-listers are up to. There's not really any prop.
Quick side notes about that commercial. That food looked kind of good. You know, I'm also thinking, right, maybe I should take a little bit of a break from content creation at least, because at this, I haven't mentioned anything about this, um, but I'm a little strung out, not necessarily from content creation, but just because, you know, like on top of balancing this with my job, among other things, like I don't take care of myself outside of when I just have, you know, outside of me just doing whatever the fuck I want to do, right? It's like when I get free time, I maximize my free time. And when I have to either do this or work, it's like, you know, that's my main focus. And so, you know, like because I have to juggle basically two jobs, essentially, I don't have a whole lot of time, free time to do the other things that are necessary for my life. I mean, God, I don't even eat when I wake up in the morning. I don't even eat dinner when I get home. Like, I just go to work. I work off of an empty stomach, and I suffer until like break and lunch. It's yeah. So to say that I'm not exactly doing great in terms of my dietary health, among other things, it's basically all you need to know on that subject. So, yeah, outside of me just kind of kind of fasting a little bit. I'm not doing so hot, uh, personally, and so I think, you know, as soon as I get some free time, you know, as soon as my weekends come back, I think what I'm probably gonna do is just take a mini break. Like maybe I'll pre-record some videos on a particular day, and I'll just release them in a sequence, like I kind of did a couple of times a few weeks ago, and I'll essentially do it like that. Well, I don't know if it was like a few weeks ago. I don't even know how long it's been. Anyways, but yeah, it's I'm thinking about doing that just so I can focus on just bettering my health a little bit because I'm not doing too great, and I feel like a lot of my mood and a lot of me is just, you know, like a lot of the, you know, like a lot of this personal suffering I'm feeling has to do with me just not doing a better job of managing myself and managing my own well-being. So yeah, I think I'll do that. I think I'll do that the first chance I'll get. I'll pre-record some videos and I'll release them in sequential order daily, and then after, you know, like, and in between all that, I'll just relax and just kind of mind my own biz. I think that's what I'll do. But yeah, that way you'll get content. That way I'll be able to focus on myself, and, you know, like I'm sure on the last day of my weekend I'll just record another series of videos for work purposes. You know, because I'm gonna be working immediately after that. But yeah. Do I really need to talk about all this in this video? Sorry. Moving on.
Criteria I'm using to decide who then no better than Factor, so use my link so you can get yourself some of the finest food out there. Now then, let's see what the B-listers are up to. There's not really any proper criteria I'm using to decide who goes in here and who doesn't, to tell you the truth. It's based entirely off the vibes I get from a chapter, so what I consider obscure may in fact be something every other person in the fanbase is well aware of. Some of these guys are really lacking in pretty much anything though, so I can't imagine you'll take issue with some being called obscure. In fact, let's start with one of those more obscure chapters now.
The Emperor's Shadows.
It's very hard to get more obscure than these guys. When I said some of these fellas are only in a White Dwarf article, I meant it. That and the book How to Paint Space Marines at nearly the last page is all they got. The Emperor's Shadows, according to what we can see, are samurai space marines. And that, my friend, is technically still conjecture, because there are no unique weapons or anything modeled onto them to truly indicate they're samurai. All of their equipment is standard Imperial fare, but they have kanji and bonsai trees on their livery. Technically, they might not be samurai, but I don't think 40k is creative enough to have what's almost certainly the only Japanese-inspired chapter not just be samurai. Don't get me wrong, samurai space marine should be a thing with some actual development, but it's also the low-hanging fruit, tasty though that fruit may be. Since the passage about them says their color scheme is based on the Black Templars, it's fairly reasonable to assume they come from Dorn's gene seed. It'd be not only fitting, since the Black Templars and Imperial Fist to a lesser extent are knights, and samurai are kinda like knights, but also more interesting than just saying they're White Scar successors because Japan and Mongolia are both in Asia. This is literally all there is about them, though. They are not a very fleshed out chapter, or at all.
I mean, I don't know if I would say that they're the same thing, because the Japanese culture and Mongolian culture is. I mean, it's a little different. It's a little different. I wouldn't say they're kind of samey, but I'll let him cook on that one. I mean, when it comes to as far as the comparison between knights, yeah, I'd say they're definitely closer to knights though. I mean, like they're basically just like they're basically just Asian knights, right? Like samurai are a lot more cooler in the sense that they're about honor and preserving traditions among other things. Like they very much function through a code of ethics, and they don't really they really operate under a strict set of rules, like a warrior's code that basically prevents them from kind of like like, because a lot of Japanese culture is about the honor system. It's about not indulging in one's baser natures. It's about achieving some type of harmony through restriction and through tradition, right? It's through the cultural norms of Japanese society do the samurai find some form of like what's the word to describe this? It's like it's through the engagement and they it's kind of the White Scars do the same thing, right? Like it's by engaging in culture and engaging in the arts, among other things, do they find some type of zen or some type of solace in the act, right? Of not just being warriors, but also in being essentially warriors, like not just warriors, but poets, artists, whatever have you. They're basically a little bit more than your typical type of sword wielding, like warrior type or even knight. They're essentially like they're their samurais are also lords. Like more often than not, if you're a samurai, you're basically like you own a good small bit of land, and you likely live a pretty nice, comfy sort of living compared to most people, and you have a level of governmental leeway that compared to other people, you basically have more power and leverage over them. You're essentially like your own sort of lord. The only lord that's even higher than you is your actual like what is it? What do they call it? Like the actual feudal lords of your lands. Like every region has a actual lord that they serve, that these samurais serve, and they're basically just kind of like armchair extensions of those particular lords. And so, yeah, that being said, like I think that a chapter that focuses on trying to mirror or try to kind of establish or take inspiration from this particular type of warrior mindset and culture is a really interesting one. I'm actually more surprised that they didn't go for that instead of, Mongolia for the White Scars, but I guess it's not typically something you see Mongolian culture in most other forms of media, especially not Western as well as English entertainment. So it seemed like it seems like it's more of like a very it was more of like a personal choice, right? It feels more like it was a more of a unique choice. I guess, to put it in a way. Because other than that, most people, when they think of Mongolians, or they think of like Chinese warriors, they think of Genghis Khan or the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and that's about the most exposure that Westerners have ever really gotten in terms of like the freaking Mongolia and the Mongols. So yeah. I mean, at least that's the more popular depictions in the West and in other English-speaking countries. But yeah, that's either here or there. I'm kind of ranting a bit.
Fleshed out. Them having Rogaldorn's gene seed is a theory entirely born of them being based on the Templars' paint scheme. We're not exactly working with very much here.
I think they look
These
kind of
are
nice.
in fact Space Marines and not a special group of Sangheili zealots.
What are they? Guardians of
These
the
are
Covenant.
in fact Space Marines and not a special group of Sangheili zealots. Instead, the Guardians of the Covenant are a Space Marine chapter descended from the Dark Angels and are stationed along the borders of the Halo stars. At some point in the 41st millennium, they even held off an invasion largely by themselves against a species simply known as the Lelith. Not too much to go on it, although it does highlight how abysmal Imperial records are that no one knows exactly when that happened. Imagine this happening today. Like the United States just forgot the year it declared independence because it didn't happen this century. They're Dark Angel successors, and their chapter icon is basically identical to the original Deathwing icon when the Dangels were still a legion, so it can be assumed they've still got plenty of deadly toys to play with. This is slightly at odds with the fact that their origins place them several millennia after the second founding, but it's not like the Dark Angels and their ilk don't regularly lie about things. You think a chapter's origins aren't something they'd also lie about? They probably just went, yeah, these are totally guys from the 16th founding or something. Yeah, sure. Ignore their iconography and all the oddly ancient weapons they have access to. The Guardians of the Covenant have a few things going for them, though I can't see why they're a background character faction. See, everyone in 40k has a thing, right? Especially Space Marines. The Blood Angels are artists that sometimes go absolutely.
I kind of like the fact that their armor looks more steel-like than like the other ceramite-coated armors that I see from other Space Marines chapters, because this one feels more like directly like they look like actual suits of armor rather than just, the colored armors of many a Space Marine chapter. I feel like they're just hardier exterior shells in comparison, right? It feels more like these are metallic knights in battle armor, in capes and everything. Like it adds a unique feel to it. And also, if they were to ever, like in Space Marines 2, bring any other new chapters, like new successor chapter roundups for the already pre-existing legions that they already got into, the color schemes that they got into the game as is. I think that if they were to bring back more Dark Angel chapters, I would hope this one would make it, because, having just purely steel ceramite would be pretty dope, I'm not gonna lie. Just purely glistening steel ceramite, I mean, it would look pretty badass, alright? It looked pretty fucking dope, alright? I mean, you have to admit. I tried to accomplish something similar, right, at one point, but I couldn't find a tint that really did that in Space Marines 2, which kind of disappointed me. The closest thing I got was gold, and, like, the gold armor tints you can put on the actual ceramite itself is a little bit wonky, because it's like it glistens, but it doesn't glisten nearly as hard as I would like it to. So yeah, if we could get some purely like steel-like armor that like that looks like it's been nicely shined or polished to some degree, that'd be pretty fucking rad, if I do say so myself.
Absolutely mental and think they're their dad. The Iron Hands are technophiles, the Raven Guard are sneaky. Even groups like the Ultramarines, that are in theory jacks of all trade, make that itself their thing, because they do it in a way only they really do. The Guardians of the Covenant, meanwhile, are perhaps one of the only chapters in the entire setting that don't just kneel before the altar of their Primarch and ignore everyone else. The Guardians of the Covenant are very studious fellas. So studious they have an ability in the Deathwatch RPG that essentially means they know a little bit about everything, ignoring especially forbidden lore or some such things like that. So studious, in fact, that on their chapter chapter banners and more are passages of not only the Lion's teachings, but the Codex Astartes. Consider this: if you take all the best bits of the Primarchs and put them together, you'd get at least one functional human being. Maybe two, but at least one. The Guardians of the Covenant are
Fair
seemingly
enough.
some of the only people to realize this, and while they idolize the Lion, they realize that all of the Primarchs were exceptional in at least one field, and taking note of their teachings is a good idea. They also have a habit of recording, observing, and in general documenting every scrap of knowledge they can get their hands on. 40k is a dangerous place after all. Knowledge on how to fight the various threats of the galaxy can only help, and so there's little knowledge they'll leave untouched, which is very Thousand Sons of them. But if you think that's a pathway into darkness in the making, consider that they also have a group of themselves dedicated to burning potentially heretical knowledge any of their allies may have. They'll take a look through their comrades' libraries, take the knowledge so that someone still has it, and then to the fires with the original. This is very Space Wolf of them, although admittedly burning books isn't an uncommon thing in the world of 40k. And to top it all off, they show particular care towards the normal humans under them, even at risk to themselves. Throw the salamanders in with them, why not? This is why I imagine they're not too focused on. Them being a bargain bin of everyone else to some extent is fun, and if you were trying to make a Space Marine chapter that was logical, this would be a great way to do it. They keep the monastic charm because they're quite secretive even by the standards of the Dark Angels, but they do more than just worship the dude whose genes they had shoved into them. The issues are that not only does this potentially make them a little Mary Sue-y, it's also not very 40k. Everyone has their shtick for a variety of reasons, be that for narrative variety, or because 40k is an inherently unreasonable place. Sure, it'd be smart to take all the advice you can find, but the smart thing to do is not only rarely chosen here, but oftentimes outright declared as heretical around these parts. So these fellows who calmly accept any wisdom they can get their hands on, while also helping those weaker than them, don't quite fit the vibe, at least as the main characters. There's a level of paranoia and prejudice-filled war crimes you need to commit to be a contender for the spotlight in 40k, and these guys don't seem to me like they'd be good candidates for either. Still, they would be a cool chapter to have an army of. Much like Warhammer itself, if you copy enough things and jam them together, you get something resembling originality. So run a Deathwatch campaign with them if you can find those old source books. I imagine they'd either be a nice breath of fresh air for veterans or a way to ease newcomers into the setting. They're logical, well-read, kind-ish for Space Marines. Have one of them be a party mentor. Then have them killed, either to test if the party learned the lessons their mentor taught them, or to teach them the lesson that tolerance is the greatest heresy of all, depending on how grimdark you want to be.
Interesting take on that one. I feel like that chapter would make for a more interesting sort of like narrative-driven story, though. Like, we put a lot of focus and emphasis on the Ultramarines and Space Marines, and I feel like with other games, you know, like, there's always a focus on other chapters, some even like original chapters or pre-existing ones. That the game developers make themselves or decide to draw and, you know, decide to directly add to, right? It's an interesting sort of thing to think about, that there's a chapter out there that kind of wants to be the, you know, like, the most of all of the parts, right? Instead of the sum of all of the parts. So, in that sense, I think that's actually would be a really interesting chapter to really, you know, like, to really munch on. As far as, like, how that, I mean, like, I think he's got some interesting points about how that's, you know, like, having a more logical and sensible chapter, or at least one that seems to want to actually learn, like, from their peers, as well as how to avoid some of their failures, is a chapter that kind of goes counter to the setting, which I think that's an interesting point to be had, but I think that the easiest way to remedy that would be just write stories where, even with all of their preparation and all of the busy work that they do, to essentially make themselves, you know, like, to further elevate themselves from the other Space Marine chapters, or to essentially make them more capable. They're essentially, like, the easiest way to kind of like curve this a little bit would be to put them in impossible scenarios, kind of like the Lamentors, right? Where they have no other choice but to kind of either really put their knowledge in strengths to the test, right? Like, if they're really focused on let's say there's a particular space marine story from this particular chapter, right? There's like one space marine who's like a really great swordsman. He decides to take a lot of inspiration from the lion from the Dark Angels and essentially wants to become the greatest duelist, right? He basically learns all that he can about swordsmanship, and he essentially builds himself up to be one of the greatest swordsmen of his chapter. But then he ends up meeting a foe in battle that basically either runs counter to his build or essentially takes him down a notch, right? In his own game, right? So to speak. Like either he's dealing with a sniper that he can't find, he can't see, and is constantly evading him, and he doesn't know how to actually counter this foe because he not only can he not see this foe, but he also can't understand how this foe is tracking him. But then there's also another way we could probably do this, which is that we give him basically like an enemy that fights on the same playing field as him, but is so utterly eclipsed in strength that he basically cannot overcome it. And so I think the easiest way to kind of like curb or even like sort of like bring back some of the grimdark elements is to really, in an almost Dark Soulsian like way, kind of like push these people to their limits and basically like create narrative scenarios where they basically, the people of this chapter have to become essentially not just warriors of the body but also of the mind and spirit, and they have to overcome impossible odds just to make it through. And I feel like that would make for an interesting story. In fact, you know what? That actually could make for an interesting idea for an actual game, right? Imagine a Soulsborne style game where you play as a space marine, but you basically fight enemies that will easily kill you in a, like if you're not too careful. And, like, just like in most Souls games, you can come back, but only it's like checkpointed, right? It's kind of like a not necessarily come back in the lore sense that, oh yeah, like you'll definitely, like there's a lore explanation why this happens. No. But just like in the sense of like, yeah, you couldn't beat the boss fight because, like you just weren't skilled enough, or because you just weren't good enough, or maybe your build just wasn't good enough either. It could be many things. I want to go with skill primarily because I feel like that if you can get like the weapons necessarily themselves don't matter. It's more so the skill, right? Like if you can actually like skillfully handle most battle encounters, kind of like MGR, right? If you can actually like get used to the weapons you use and the abilities that you have at your disposal, I feel like it makes most battle encounters feel uh it'll not only make the battle encounters feel more intense and enjoyable, but every mistake and every death you encounter will be a result not necessarily of the game's bullshit, but because you just weren't like you weren't solid enough in how you do in the combo system, right? It's like Devil May Cry meets a almost Soulsborne like esque experience. Or no, maybe better yet, right? It's basically Devil May Cry and MGR mixed into a game. Forget the Soulsborne elements. Devil May Cry, MGR, mishmashed into a brainchild that is this particular like 40k game. That'd make for an interesting story using this chapter, I would think. I don't know. I'm just spitballing. I just realized I went on a tangent. I'm sorry. I'm tired, okay? I'm tired. I'm sorry. Fucking tired.
Did you know that we know all of the
What time?
first founding
33,
Space
wonderful.
Marines? Truly, we do. As long as you don't mind dipping back into the wellspring of old lore that is Rogue Trader, which statistically, only roughly a third of you watching the
What was
wellspring
this?
founding space.
Valedictors.
Did you know that we know all of the original first founding Space Marine legions? Truly, we do. As long as you don't mind dipping back into the wellspring of old lore that is Rogue Trader, which statistically, only roughly a third of you watching this have even a chance of having been alive for, if my analytics speak the truth. The Valedictors, alongside the rather more well-known Rainbow Warriors, are one of the original first founding legions, back when 40k was like, cool, and not a way for the man to make money, man. There really isn't much known on them, to the point that they only have the slightest bit more than and the Emperor's Shadows, who only have a paint scheme to go off of. They were once upon a time a legion that was based on the eastern fringes of the galaxy. Now do you see this map here? You see the very edge past even Segmentum Ultima? That's where these guys were. If they were stationed any farther east, they'd be outside the Milky Way. In spite of being in the ass end of nowhere, they saw action against not only the Eldar and Orcs, but even the traitor forces of the Horus Heresy. Incidentally, this means that yes, the Horus Heresy was at least conceptually known about to the public, and we still knew who the first founding legions were in their entirety. It's a good answer to the question, why does GW change the lore so much? It's because they've always been doing that, and you just weren't alive for the first few changes. And that's pretty much it. Remember that this is Rogue Trader era lore we're talking about here. The Horus Heresy being GW's most milked-to-death cow hadn't yet become a thing, and it was instead still in the realm of myth and legend. Still, while canon has certainly left them behind, they're cool to look at as a historical part of Warhammer as a hobby. They're part of the setting's history when GW could just decide one of the original Space Marine chapters wasn't one of the original chapters anymore, and that was it. As one final fun fact, Latin to English on Google Translate says that Valedictor means farewell. If you'd like to be poignant, this accidentally becomes oh so accurate, and these guys are a farewell to the old style of Warhammer writing. If you'd like to get busy with the homebrew and bring these guys back, either as your tabletop army or for a role-playing campaign, it can be significantly more badass. Say farewell to all those you know and love, because after the Valedictors come into town, you won't get a chance to see them again.
Genesis chapter.
You know Mini-Me from Austin Powers? That's the Genesis chapter for the Ultramarines. Now, some of you may think that's dismissive, and you'd be right, it is. These are still Space Marines, proud warriors of the Imperium of Man who can rip through normal people like butter. That doesn't make being dismissive of them any less correct. Something you may have noticed about 40k, even if you aren't that big into Space Marine stories like myself, is that the Ultramarines are involved in a whole lot of conflicts. Tyranids, Orcs, Chaos, that's just the tip of the iceberg of the opponents they've fought. Naturally, they incur plenty of casualties, because even if you fully buy into Space Marines being near unstoppable, you still have to accept that they take some losses, and yet they keep coming back for more. How is this, may you ask? Because either they have to be lax with recruiting standards, or the Ultramarines are breaking the codex their dad wrote and they have way more than 1,000 Marines. Turns out that the answer is sometimes a Genesis Marine will be promoted to Ultramarine. If the Ultramarines take a few too many casualties, or they can't afford to be short even a single Astartes, they'll grab a few Genesis Marines and fill in those gaps. Be it a librarian or your bog standard battle brother, there's always a chance that the Ultramarine in question might have been loaned from elsewhere. Honestly, for as much as it is them not following the spirit of the Codex Astartes, I absolutely love that. It's both Roman-inspired, since Rome had plenty of battles where they lost thousands and came back with more legions, and funny bureaucracy stuff. Of course the legion born from the guy who could weaponize spreadsheets would find a way around a number limit. They just needed one singular chapter to be down for filling in their empty spots, and truth be told, that's probably a legitimate honor. For all that it is them poaching Marines, those Marines get to become a member of one of the original Astartes legions. For the Genesis chapter itself, they're almost like Ultramarine fanboys. Even when they aren't being told to paint their red armor blue and switch teams, they regularly go on campaigns alongside the Blueberries, helping them against the various foes they face. When they aren't following around the Smurfs like an army of little brothers, they're still making sure that they're as close to the Codex Astartes as physically possible. They will debate any potential actions and doctrines to see if they're Codex compliant, and if they can't figure out if something is or isn't, they'll just go ask the Ultramarines to ensure they're in compliance with the parent chapter. It's almost adorable. That being said, I think they'd be willing to ignore pretty much any Codex deviations if Guilliman said it was okay. After all, they love the Ultramarines, and Guilliman as their Primarch is the embodiment of the Ultramarines. If Grandpa Smurf says a certain action is okay, then I bet the Genesis Marines would be fine with it. Maybe they rationalize it, as Guilliman writing the Codex Astartes means that anything he says is inherently Codex compliant. They did get into a scuffle with the Night Lords during the 13th Black Crusade, but even though they ultimately lost, they gave a good account of themselves and took down plenty of the cowards with them. Overall, while they are a chapter of Ultramarines at home, they still fit a great role in the franchise. Letting the Ultramarines fight in almost every single major battle without a valid explanation of how they're still around makes them the ultimate author's pets. With the Genesis chapter's existence, this is handily solved. And while it does technically mean they're not Codex compliant, realistically this doesn't matter. There's plenty of chapters out there that aren't Codex compliant in the letter or spirit of the law, and aside from it just being kinda weird, there's no real reason why Marines can't shack up with another chapter for a bit. If nothing else, even if you think this entire thing is a pathetic excuse to break the Codex by the people who wrote it, they're still Space Marines. Calling a Genesis Marine a discount Ultramarine to his face is getting you the kind of beating that earns you a closed casket funeral.
I mean, to be fair on that point, I feel like he's got a point with the Genesis chapter. I'm not too sure what the Genesis chapter is. By his explanation, I think that's I think it's a I wouldn't say it's a crude summarization, but it's probably a very broad one. But I feel like if that's the explanation we're going with here, and I remember they do have the chapter does actually exist in Space Marines 2. I don't remember exactly what the flavor text was for their color scheme when it was introduced and you can actually look at it, but from what I understand, just based off of what I'm hearing here, the Genesis chapters are essentially just kind of like these are the guys who basically like they're the players who basically on the bench waiting to get in to play the game rather than being the runner-ups for the game itself, right? They're not out there in the field. They're kind of waiting their turn and just kind of like waiting for when the other players basically need to take their breaks or need to get off the court for whatever reason. I feel like that's what they are. They're basically kind of like stand-ins for any like lost brother within the chapter, I guess, for the Space Marines. But that's I don't know if it's just exclusively Space Marines either. They could probably be co-opted for other chapters as well, for all I know. But like, and for probably all Pancreas nodes, and for that matter, I have no idea. Point being, I feel like the Genesis chapter are at least an interesting chapter because it sounds like that they seem to actually really go a long way into wanting to build up the brothers in their chapter and focus on training and furthering their and deepening their own skills and knowledge rather than actually being out there in the front lines doing the busybody work, right, like the Ultramarines do. And it does actually bring up an interesting point too, that if the Genesis chapter is kind of filling the numbers a bit for the Ultramarines, it kind of makes sense then that they can get into all of the conflicts that they do, and they don't exactly seem to really be losing in terms of numbers and reach in spite of that fact, right? I mean, I feel like that kind of makes sense. I feel like that, at least in terms of like in terms of standard rules and among other things, especially even when it comes to like rules pertaining to the lore, I feel like it makes sense, especially with 40k, that you could break some rules in order to make the story make sense or even be more interesting. I don't think everything needs to be lore accurate. I feel like you can have an interesting story where everything kind of breaks apart and, things kind of fall by the wayside and you can see other shades of gray or shade or just different sort of like shades of yeah, just different shades of gray of how things get handled in the Imperium and among other Space Marine chapters or whatever the hell it is, right? I feel like it adds more depth and believability to the universe when nothing works exactly as is intended, and everything is either kind of used or abused to a certain level of degree. I feel like that's appropriate. I feel like that makes sense.
Another Ultramarine successor chapter, these guys are the answer to the question, what if instead of Space Marines being super soldiers that were semi-divine warriors, they were the least competent people in the setting? Or to put it another way, what if an Eldar fan was in charge of making Space Marine lore? As with most Ultramarine successor chapters, they love the Codex Astartes, with one exception however. When they deploy, they tend to just throw an entire company at bare minimum against threats. While I do think Marines are overestimated, even I can admit that an entire company of them will get a mission solved nicely. After all, 100 Spartans thrown onto a single objective would certainly solve most problems. Even if they all end up dying, like with the various batches of the Spartan 3s being thrown on suicide missions, they'd surely complete the mission. This strategy unfortunately makes the assumption that the super soldiers in question aren't ragingly incompetent. During the liberation of Antilles IV, one of their companies is overrun by the Black Legion, and they detonate their position to go down swinging. Unfortunately, the singular surviving scout marine that made it out couldn't take all of the gene seed with him, and the apothecary on hand was apparently an idiot and just left it hanging around. So a World Eater's apothecary grabbed some Avenging Sun gene seed and used it to stabilize his warband with it. Now admittedly, this all just sounds rather unfortunate than making them totally incompetent. I'm not finished. During the battle for Archimedon, their third company was tasked with defending a spaceport. This proved to be a difficult task because it's a war zone, so instead they just decided to blow it up. Their chapter master wasn't exactly thrilled to hear about this, but instead of bringing the hammer down, he gave them a chance to redeem themselves by fighting on the planet of Helmabad, which had a bit of a civil war problem. Some traitors were trying to spread chaos of both the capitalized and uncapitalized variety. After a few months of fighting, they discovered that the planet wasn't very far off from a massive demon invasion. Instead of doing something heroic, like valiantly trying to defend the planet even in the face of death, or smart, like trying to gather reinforcements, wage guerrilla warfare, or something else like that, they chose the third option, abandon ship. So they all left, killing the chaplain when he tried to stop them, and delivered the planetary governor to the Chaos Cultists in exchange for safe travel off-world. And then, because this was obviously heresy of the highest order, they just took off for the Eye of Terror. They ran away from Chaos, and then because they're so cowardly and stupid, they just joined it right after. Instead of making at least a token effort to become renegade pirates but still fight demons, they started worshipping them. And no, we're not done. There was a campaign called the Harrowing of the Night Reapers. From the name, you'd think the Night Reapers...
From everything I've heard so far, I feel like you couldn't get any lower than this for a Loyalist chapter. And no, they get worse. They get even worse. It's terrifying.
Reapers would get harrowed. Fair enough, but it certainly wasn't by these morons. The Avenging Sun sent in 4 entire companies and all the equipment and supporting staff and ships that go with such a force. The Night Reapers Renegade chapter ambushed them, stole one of their ships, and forced whoever was left to retreat. But to me, the worst of all was the Taros campaign. The planet of Taros was secretly helping the Tau, and it naturally turned into one big ol' military campaign. The Avenging Suns land, and it was going smoothly. They landed with no issues, butchered their way to the governor's palace, and when they figured he was hiding in a crowd of people, they opened fire on the crowd. The Imperium are the good guys, remember? Anyways, they analyzed the remains of the crowd and found out that the governor not only wasn't there, but no one there was even remotely related to him. Then Tau Mantis started flying overhead, and they lost about 80 men after a 2-day battle, I believe it was. To be fair as possible, they bloodied the Tau back. To stop being fair, they lost several Terminators and a Dreadnought. They were outmaneuvered by the Tau, which I'm no Tau hater, that's completely fair, but also the PDF of the planet. The PDF. Do you know how incompetent you have to be made a fool of by the planetary defense forces in this setting? Sure, some planets have well-trained PDF, but a well-trained PDF means that by the time the guard or whoever else shows up to save the day, there's still a PDF left fighting. That isn't the bottom of the barrel, that's punching through the barrel and getting stuck in it. At this point, I'm just gonna assume their name comes from their desperate attempts to avenge the various losses they keep accumulating.
Damn. That's not exactly a glowing endorsement. The Avenging Suns sound woefully incompetent, but honestly, I feel like I don't know what to make of that. That's actually kind of funny. There's actually a Space Marine chapter that, despite the fact that they are a chapter of fucking Space Marines, they can't seem to get their shit together. That's crazy. It's actually kind of crazy. God, they lost several dreadnoughts. They fired at an open crowd of civilians and did not manage to kill the governor, from whom they were trying to assassinate in the first place, and why they even opened fire on the crowd in the first place. It's crazy. It's crazy. Okay? That's monumental levels of just, you done fucked up. God.
People already forget the Iron Hands exist. I'm sorry, Iron Hands fans, but it's a regular thing people accidentally call you the Iron Warriors, and your Primarch dies before the Horus Heresy book hit the double digits. You are clearly not the favorite. And now we have a technically Iron Hand successor chapter, the Steel Confessors. The children of perhaps the least talked about Loyalist chapter, though I suppose it's a close competition between them and the Raven Guard on that front. The Steel Confessors were born out of the close relationship the Iron Hands and the Mechanicus have. One day there was a particularly rough battle against Chaos that the Mechanicus had to call on the Iron Hands to help them out with. The day was won, but both sides were absolutely decimated in the fighting. As a show of good faith between these two factions, the clans of the Iron Hands gifted the Mechanicus with Gene Seed, and the Mechanicus in turn devoted 3 entire Forge Worlds to helping them rebuild, as well as specialized tech priests. After such horrible fighting, the Mechanicus had an idea. We now have this Gene Seed, why don't we make Space Marines loyal to us instead of the Imperium as a whole? That way they'd have their own super soldiers to act as a rapid response force against any potential threats, instead of waiting for the other ones to finally come help. And so they did just that, building their own Throne chapter. Of course, the Inquisition almost immediately caught wind of this and asked
I would think that would be the first thing they would do, right? I thought that's kind of what the Tech Marines were supposed to serve, but okay, uh, whatever.
them what the hell they were doing, and they tried to get the High Lords to bring the hammer down for this blatant power grab. The High Lords, for once in their existence, actually used a bit of brain power, however, and simply said the Mechanicus had to relinquish them to the Imperium as a whole rather than keeping this chapter in their back pocket. They agreed, but they were bitter about it and so named the chapter the Steel Confessors. The Confessors then went on to become just another chapter of Space Marines, albeit one with incredibly close ties to the Mechanicus still. As you can expect of an Iron Hand successor chapter created directly by the Mechanicus, the Steel Confessors have all sorts of high-tech gizmos, as well as plenty of vehicles to throw at their foes. They're all at least passingly good at handling machinery, they hate weakness and love replacing body parts with machinery, and most interestingly of all, they worship the Emperor as a god. Of course, they worship him as the Omnissiah, who achieved true omnipotent unity with the Machine God when he sat on the Golden Throne, but that's still worshiping Big E as a deity. And of course, to complete the Trinity, we have Ferrus Manus, who they worship as the closest a mortal can get to becoming one with the Machine God. Since their creation was a bit of a politically turbulent affair, they were gifted the Forge World of Craxus IV as their chapter homeworld, which was in many ways perfect for them. As a Forge World, it was a Mechanicus haven, so they could still be buddies with their creators, but it's still firmly Imperial, so it won't bother anyone when they squat on it. And because it's on the eastern fringes of the galaxy, they were far enough away from the Imperium as a whole that they didn't have to worry about any Inquisitors deciding this chapter was still too much of a risk to allow to exist. It even had a cloaking device that made it appear like a barren rock to sensors scanning it, as well as its very own psychic choir to help boost the presence of the Astronomicon in the region. Unfortunately, the weather forecast one day called for total cloud coverage, acid rain, and an invasion by Hive Fleet Behemoth. Initially, the chapter master didn't consider them a threat, so he only called a few companies back to defend the homeworld at first. He probably regretted this choice around the time it was discovered that Tyranids don't have sensors, but rather an insatiable hunger that has evolved them to be able to track life wherever they go, and landed en masse. He definitely regretted it around the time he was being chopped into pieces by the millions of bioforms assaulting the planet, and what was left of the first company had to retreat. 2 entire companies were destroyed, with the rest suffering severe casualties and the chapter being reduced to less than half strength. Nevertheless, they were able to regroup and began rebuilding on the planet of Kalavaya, which they swore to protect. Presumably taking an interest in becoming exterminators, the future was one of surprising hope for a 40k army that was largely devoured by bugs. All of this lore makes them stand out a bit, and at least to me is cool, but you know what the funniest part about it is? All of this lore might be wrong. I could be telling you a complete fib on accident. This chapter
Well, good to know then, Pancreas. At least you admitted it, and I didn't have to hear from somebody in my fucking comments section. You know, I've actually had some people in my comment section tell me that some people get some of the lore bits, or, get some of the things wrong, or get some of the lore bits wrong about some things. And it's like, that's all well and good, but it's like, sometimes they actually just straight up attack the creator, and it's like, let's not do that. Let's not do that. Let's not be mean to the actual creators themselves. Like, I don't think most people go out of their way to essentially perjure themselves, especially not on the internet, where that's very, and when we're talking about 40k, we're talking about anything on, like, through the purposes of online communities, that's especially in a video format like YouTube, it's easy to be in the wrong. I mean, like, I'll be the first one to admit that I'm sure I've said plenty of things online that, even though I myself might think that they're actually true, I could easily just be as equally as wrong, right? Like, just because I say that something may or may not actually be true because of my own personal experience times the things that I've seen and researched personally in my own time, doesn't necessarily mean that I'm true. Because, you'll never know if the things that you actually read about online, or the things you hear about, the things you've experienced, are either, like, the actual truth of, like, most people's experiences, or are just, like, a very minute sort of, like, a random bit of just, like, a, how do you, how you put it? It's like it could just be an isolated case of you experiencing something that not very many people get to experience, whether it's by or from a particular group, people, or whatever have you. It's it's an interesting sort of conundrum, right? Because you're not because like even especially when we're talking about like lore bits, like there is a thorough line for where you can pull information from. Granted, like you can certainly go and you can do some research on some things as well as some chapters, and you could probably get a comprehensive idea of what the chapters are like, but your interpretations to them will vary between other people who probably have done the same thing, because other people will take certain information and bits away from it, and they'll probably read a lot into it, because I'm sure the problem with especially with a lot of Warhammer stuff, is that because it likes to be mysterious and vague about certain details, a lot of people are going to assume that when they use certain terms and words to describe certain scenarios and situations, people are going to read into them a little tad differently than some other people might as well. So you're going to get some weird, inconsistent instances where people will say one thing and somebody else will say another thing, and you'll just get like a rabbit hole of like, well, did this happen? Did that happen? Like, did Calgar actually brutalize like this hive tyrant, or did he absolutely and demonstrably butcher the fucking shit out of Hitler, right? Like there's a level of things, right? And it's about the emphasis times the terminology times a lot of different like like and the way it's described, right? Like there's a lot that goes into reading into a particular thing. And English is an interesting language, right? Because you can easily get a lot of English is one of those funny languages where you can easily read into something one way, but you can read into it in a different sense. Like the reason why English is such a funny language for uh innuendos, for example, a lot of sexual innuendos, it's because it's real easy to uh kind of make a play on words, so to speak, when it comes to how you can use words to describe certain particular instances or things or issues. You get what I mean, right? I'm kind of going again on another tangent, but it's basically, like I feel like it's kind of annoying that we do get people sometimes who's a little too hard on creators for getting things wrong. And I would never say that I am someone who gets things right either. Like I've put it in my mission statement, right? I put it in my channel bio, right? I am a fucking dumbass on the internet. Like you should never take anything anyone says at face value, and if you do, you're more so the clown than really the clown you heard it from, right? That's my 2 cents on it. Like unless you actually do the research, unless you've actually experienced these things, and unless you can actually be proven right or wrong about these particular things, I'm not. It doesn't. Look, at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. None of this stuff really matters. It doesn't matter who's right and who's wrong. At the end of the day, our experiences are our own, our knowledge is our own, and what we've learned and what we come to understand is just one of a brevity of different worldly, different colors and experiences of things that we can all put into a nice little collage that is this thing called humanity and also the internet. I would not want to conflate it in any other way other than the fact that the internet is just full of a bunch of different walks of life and people who honestly have their own problems and have gone through their own experiences and all kinds of things, right? Who am I to question the authority or the beliefs or even the sanctity of one's ideas when everyone is free to their own viewpoints and interpretations? I would never want to clown on someone, and I would never want to feel like I need to criticize someone unless they're being objectively wrong about a thing. Like, the only time I've ever actually gotten I've been objectively critical is when I was reacting to the pussification of video games by a creator whose name I can't even remember now. And in that video, he basically said that Spider-Man 2 was the pussification of Peter Parker. Well, it was more like a cuckification of Peter Parker, and it's like, like he uses very explicit, explicit terms. Um, I agree to an extent of what he was going with, but I don't like the like the summarization he was going with. And so as much as I understood where he was coming from, I disagreed with the way he was basically describing it, and I also thought it was just disingenuous the way he was selling the story of Spider-Man 2. I don't think Spider-Man 2 was that bad. I think that they did do some things wrong, but again, now I'm getting on another tangent. Point being, let's just not be assholes. Let's just try not to be assholes, okay? Let's just agree to disagree. Let's just make our points in a vacuum. And if people agree with it, then it will be celebrated by people who see it and who view it and think it's worth passing around. If not, it dies where it stands, okay? That's how the internet should be. It's how the internet was basically like, and from the very beginning, let's just continue to exercise that. Moving on.
Chapter's lore comes from a Games Day / Golden Demon event in Birmingham that happened in 2005 and heavily featured them. All of the information available comes from an Index Astartes article about them. The problem is, no one can find the original handout. You can find what's supposedly a faithful recreation of the article online on a website that looks like it hasn't been updated since 2005, but the original source seems to have been lost to time. So all we have is the article recreation to take as the truth. We have pictures of their color scheme and pictures of a life-size Marine painted like them, so we know this thing happened, but their lore we are entirely taking this one article on faith for. And honestly, that's the most interesting thing about this chapter. The fact that for all we know, everything about them that's known is complete bullshit, because all we have to know about them boils down to one person going, "Dude, trust me," with what could very well be his own chapter's homebrew lore. It is endlessly funny to me that the best arguments against 40k being parody are the things that could perfectly fit into 40k like this happening in real life. God bless you, Steel Confessors. A part of me wishes that we never do see the original pamphlet of your lore, because this is a fun story to tell. The Halo Brethren are a group of Marines of unknown pretty much everything, including color scheme. They were part of the assault.
I don't want to pause again, but just a little side note. How fucking funny would it be if you made a homebrew and then you pass around the idea and lore of your homebrew and it's so appealing to so many people that it just becomes canon? Like, imagine that. Imagine that. That'd be funny. That'd be a funny story. That'd be a funny thing to happen. And you don't even get any of the royalties from it. Nobody knows who started it, right? It's just like you made a homebrew, you passed on the story, it gets passed on enough, and suddenly everyone thinks it's an actual chapter that exists. That'd be fucking hilarious.
Assault against the Eversor Assassin Temple alongside the Sable Swords and Imperial Fists, and we know nothing else about them. Artwork of them does not exist. Lore of them, aside from that single blurb, does not exist. You cannot get more on the sidelines than that. So why did I bother mentioning them? When there's this little to go off of, what is the possible point of bringing these guys up? Well, you see their name. Yeah, I like Halo a lot. What are you gonna do about it? As has been mentioned time and time again, the record-keeping of the Imperium is ass. If you have a document and you have the Administratum save it, I hope it wasn't important or you have a photographic memory, because that document is gone. This inability to keep anything written down properly is how we got the 13th founding of Space Marines. This is known as the Dark Founding, but for once writers were able to keep the impulse to make 13 the bad number in check. It's not called the Dark Founding because of some terrible secret or tragedy that befell it. Nope, it's called the Dark Founding because no one has a fucking clue who came out of it. The records are all in the dark somewhere. I bet good money on the records still existing, they're just lost. Like in a really big library or under a really big pile of tax papers, who knows. We know the Death Spectres came out of it, the Crimson Sabers / Crimson Slaughter, and these guys, the Exorcists. Created from the gene seed of Rogel Dorn, though they aren't told this until they become a part of the first company, the Exorcists are in a lot of ways no different from the rest of the various Codex-compliant Space Marine chapters. There is the slight exception that they have 2 extra scout companies, but that's about it. They hate the enemies of man, particularly Chaos, and will serve the Imperium as all Space Marines do. The key to their differences is, of course, in the name. During one battle, the Exorcists were out and about fighting demons. As brutal as you'd expect this to be, it only got worse when a Lord of Change possessed their chapter master, Enoch Trismegistus. This Marine, who I will call Tri from here on out because that name is a mouthful and a half, was actually able to awaken his latent psychic powers because of this, and called out to the chapter's chief librarian to help banish the demon. The day was saved, but naturally for such a catastrophic event as a demon invasion, the Inquisition took notice of the entire affair. Luckily, however, the faction of Inquisitors that found them were the Plutonians. TLDR, these guys believe that exorcising demons can and should be done as part of training, at least for elite soldiers like Space Marines. They interrogated Tri to hell and back, but when they found out he was not only pure, but seemed especially resistant to demons, they were over the moon. They proposed to Tri that if he had done this, surely his entire chapter could and should as well, and Tri agreed with them. So the Plutonians set up shop alongside the Exorcists and started jamming demons into them before helping them remove said demons. The result of this process is that the Exorcists as Marines are almost entirely invisible to demons. The only ones that could notice them are greater demons, and even then I would imagine you need a named one to really nail down where an Exorcist Marine is at any given moment. This has turned them into essentially an entire chapter of Grey Knights, allowing them to act against demons and even more mortal heretics with more effectiveness than anyone but the Grey Knights. And just to make sure their newfound Marines are worth their salt at killing demons, they have a damn demon world they use as training grounds. With a company of Grey Knights on standby, new recruits are tested at this planet to see how they do. If they do well, which to be frank I'm pretty sure just means survive, they pass and become a full-fledged battle brother. Now the question that may be in the back of your mind is that if these guys are so good at killing demons and can't even be seen by them, why don't they just make this standard practice? Well, a few reasons, and we'll go through the shallowest ones first. Though they are legitimately immune to further possession and corruption, they still mutate. The spirit may be willing and safe, but the body gains some scales and perhaps an extra arm. They remove these mutations when they come in, but more often than not, they just grow back. With the Imperium being as obsessed with the holy human form as it is, this wouldn't be accepted as standard practice for that reason alone. Their homeworld, called Banish because of course it is a dreary and barren place with only primitive humans living on it, and I imagine that's on purpose. Sure, it does mean they get hardier recruits, but it also means there's nothing of value for any tithe collectors to come asking for, letting the Exorcist stay hidden. The process is also an obviously incredibly dangerous thing. They are inviting a demon into their bodies to then be banished. The starting point of this is learning forbidden lore that can drive people mad. It drove an Inquisitor so mad when he saw the casualty rate of it that he took all the reject Marines that failed to pass and formed a Chaos Warband with them. They need to be like Goldilocks with this because too strong a demon and the candidate just dies or is permanently possessed. Too weak a demon and they don't get anything out of the process if they succeed. There's a reason the Exorcists have 2 extra scout companies, and it's not because they love the idea of Space Marine scouts. They have to have it because the process of creating an Exorcist Marine is so dangerous. It's naturally a very time-consuming process too, because the possession and exorcism only occurs after all the other trials and augmentations that go into a Space Marine have been completed. The aspirant might die on the table at the last hurdle, and now you've wasted years of time and resources on this dead dude. Let's say it works though. Congratulations, you have the most traumatized Marine around. He's a Space Marine, so he can still probably work through it, but some of that trauma is a lingering attitude based on the demon that was jammed inside of him. Khorne, Slaanesh, Nurgle, Tzeentch, hell, maybe there's a Marine out there that really likes cheese because someone shoved a vermin lore that got lost inside of him. The chapter has also formed something eerily reminiscent of the warrior lodges from the Luna Wolves before they were traitors, which is a sentence I hope worries you. To be fair, this is more of a coping mechanism than anything, and has as a result helped them become proficient in all sorts of tactics as they seemingly try to distract themselves from their semi-cursed existence. They're called the Orisons, and they go over all sorts of different tactics and whatnot to ensure these fellows are never caught flat-footed. In spite of them being geared towards demons, they're still Space Marines. While I'd still say the Grey Knights are better against demons than the Exorcist, I'd wager the Exorcists are better against everyone else. The gear is obviously worse for the Marines, but the tactics they use are varied and can be applied to various different enemies. They're even somewhat resistant to non-demon psychers, sort of like mini blanks, which would mean if nothing else they're great against demons and the Eldar. The Grey Knights, meanwhile, are geared towards demons, so they aren't fighting optimally if they're deployed elsewhere. The Exorcists certainly aren't loved, at least in-universe. Plenty of others have and would call them heretical if they knew of their existence, and it's easy to see why. It takes one incident where things go catastrophically wrong during the exorcism of a demon for the entire chapter to get wiped, or at least the system they're in to fall to chaos. But they're unique, fun, and flesh out the setting that much more through their presence. Also, they look like loyalist word bearers, which is fun. For real, they have the exact same color scheme as the word bearers did, and you gotta admit their icon looks at least a little demonic with those horns. Tempting fate a bit much, aren't we, lads? There's more chapters out there, plenty more, but those are the ones that I wanted to talk about. Now, for most of you, feel free to skip ahead, video's just about over, but I'd like to take a moment to soapbox a little bit. In conversations with others, something I and plenty others often hear are complaints that someone's favorite faction isn't getting updated. That's fair, and I mean hell, I've done that plenty, whenever I mention the Eldar, in fact. But a much less fair complaint I've heard is against certain factions getting updated because it means theirs isn't getting the update. And a very related complaint is people wondering why something exists. Why this army needs to exist, why this chapter even exists, as if the presence of them in lore and sometimes tabletop is a waste of space. I think that's the wrong attitude to take. If you take away anything from this video besides there's a whole lot of Marine chapters out there, I hope you take away that all these small background chapters, and indeed some armies that don't get much prominence, aren't wastes of space. They flesh out the setting, make it feel like an actual universe that's lived in and is always moving. The time it took to write paragraphs about these different chapters shouldn't be looked on as time that should have been spent talking about the Ultramarines or some Primarch or the other. All these background fellows make 40k feel full and interesting. If it was only the quote-unquote main characters, it wouldn't feel like a proper universe, it'd feel more like a soap opera about the world's most powerful dysfunctional family. Don't ask, why does this chapter exist? Don't complain when a different army gets an update and yours doesn't. Not every time, at least. Sometimes that's valid. Celebrate that the universe of 40k is that much more full, and the tabletop game has that many more options. Because if nothing else, all these background fellows are another way to paint your army and tell some stories with your friends about your games of Warhammer. Thanks for watching, and if you stuck around for that, I hope you take it to heart. Or call me a bitch in the comments for having feelings about things. And thank you as always to my wonderful channel members. You are the background chapter of Space Marines to my Warhammer 40k, filling out the roster and making the channel that much better. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there.
You know, I have to agree with that. I actually like that ending sentiment. He's true. Very right about that. There is a lot, you know, like I said this in my, I'm not gonna fucking, not gonna mention that video. No, I don't want to think about that video again, ever. But anyways, yeah. No, I feel like that this is a
The
sane.
13th founding really is funny, though. Like, what do you mean you lost the founding? Go find it. Warhammer 40k, as you all know, is
No, stop. Oh yeah. But yeah, no. I feel like that it's funny
covering Warhammer.
That he mentions this because that's exactly how I feel a little bit in another video that I reacted of his where I basically said something similar, right? Like if you focus on just fleshing out like the characters, the story of these characters, and add more unique things to the setting, it makes it feel that much more interesting, right? Because with the fact that Warhammer 40k is a massive sprawling universe instead of a planet of different varieties of cultures and races, it feels so much more expansive and it feels so much larger than like the fantasy Warhammer does. And so with that being the issue, it leads to the question of like, well, there's so much shit in this universe and there's so many things going on all at once. It's like, well, how do you find the time to manage it all? And it's just like, well, like the interesting, like with it being so big and sprawling as it is, like it ceases to be interesting on some level, because unless you're like a named character or you're a character who's actually really popular in the lore or the setting, or you're one of the main chapters of the Space Marine chapters, you're not exactly like, nothing is really that interesting. But I feel like that's again a problem, not necessarily with the setting itself, but more so a problem with the people who come in to write the stories that fill that setting. I feel like there's a lot of great stories in 40k. I feel like the argument that we're having is that there's not enough interesting stories, like involved. If there's not a whole lot of progress made or interesting stories to tell about the actual main sort of like narrative crux of the franchise itself. You know, write stories that fill that if you want, or don't even do that. Write stories that help to build the universe a bit more if you want as well. Like you can do a lot of things. Not everything has to fit in a particular sort of like framework, right? Like I'm not sure how fantasy Warhammer stories are, function or are like, but I'm sure they're no different than most other fantasy stories I've ever seen. Like the interesting thing that I have with Warhammer 40K, and the one reason why I think it's more interesting and why I like it a bit more than the fantasy elements of it, is just because of the fact that because there's so much more open-ended space, there's so much room and wiggle room to be able to tell those unique stories. Because like even Bricky himself mentioned it in his lore dives and videos that you could tell a lot of stories within the setting if you so wish to. And because there's a lot of different like cultures and even different human cultures and other races in this setting that likely also have their own different unique sort of takes on cultural norms and isms that also probably fill their own sort of unique facets within the universe of 40K, it makes sense, right, that there's a lot of flavor to be had here, and there's a lot of things to build on, but there's not a whole lot of attention and focus placed on it. And it really takes somebody who's particularly inspired within the setting and within the franchise itself to really want to go through the effort of building upon what's already there or is established, or even go even further beyond that, create something new within the setting to make it more interesting, to add more fuel to the pile. And I feel like that makes a lot of sense, right? Because 40K is already a massive franchise as is. Like the biggest problem is just getting people who aren't even familiar with the chapter, who probably don't even know anything about 40K into the setting. Like again, I thought 40K before I was a fan of it myself, was that it was just a bunch of like tabletop nerds or just nerds in general who like to rant and rave about a fictional universe ad nauseum that has the most convoluted lore outside of the fucking Bible. But it's like it's actually more interesting, and it's so much more than that. And you don't really see that when you're only engaged, when you're only, like when you're only, sort of exposure to it is like screenshots and the random things people talk about online or make references to that you don't really fully understand. And it's like you have to cross the gap at some point, right? And the way a lot of people, including myself, crossed that gap initially was through other forms of media and games. Like I got into it with Space Marines 2. I wasn't particularly interested in the 40K through Space Marines 1 because before I played Space Marines 2, I played Space Marines 1 and I wasn't that into it. Like I thought, okay, well I can kind of get an idea of what I'm going to be expecting when I actually play Space Marines 2. This seems fun enough. I don't see why not. At least it'd be a more up-to-date version. It seems like a unique setting. I guess it would be kind of an interesting romp through, if nothing else. I think it's kind of weird that, like these are just big giant dudes with tiny heads. It's like the Gears of War effect, kinda, sorta, of like just going in, hacking things to death with chain swords, which I thought was kind of weird, unique, and equal parts kind of stupid. But I quickly warmed up to the idea in Space Marines 2 because with everything looking so cool and the presentation being so sleek, like it's hard not to fall in love with the vibes of the game, especially in the early introductory phase of the game because you're starting off in the Death Watch rather than the Ultramarines. And so you're just kind of like engaging in what you're seeing, and you're just like, this is actually pretty interesting. You're not being hit with lore, you're not being hit with stupid shit you're not going to know the answers to. You're just engaged in the moment. And it's the moment that really sells it to you. And I feel like that a lot of people were vibing so fucking hard with the setting itself and with Space Marines 2's Kadaku and the way it was presented and the way the story was presented, that it commanded respect, and it commanded people to understand, to learn, to want to actively engage in the setting itself. And I feel like that is the biggest argument that I have for why I think we need more media that focuses on these particular stories, and why I think we need to have more media that focuses on fleshing out other stories outside of just the main ones, right? Like, there's a whole universe of content out here, and no one's going to fill them out unless you actually go through the process of doing it yourself. And even then, you could just create your own shit. It's great. This universe is fantastic. It it lends itself to such a wide variety and brevity of creativity and nuance that you can just do anything with it. And you don't even have to flesh out the parts that don't make sense to you. You could just choose not to actively engage in that. You could just even create your own faction and not even give a shit about some of the more finer or minute details, because you could just pass it off as just like, oh well, they're just a different breed of soldier or a different breed of space marine. Like, they don't follow exactly one to one with like the Codex Astartes, among other things, right? It's like it's everything in this universe is entirely doable, even if you're just winging it, I feel like. And maybe that's not exactly true, but I feel like with the 40K as a franchise, it's an interesting wild ride. Anyways, I'm ranting too much again. I'm sorry. I'll stop. Anyways, thank you all so much for watching. Gonna have to get that one out too. I'm tired. I'm gonna see you all in the next video. I don't know if I'm gonna edit this one down or not, but I shall see you all in the next one. And hopefully I won't be too tired when I do it. Bye-bye.